You've probably heard Queen Brunhilda was executed. That word is too clean. Too polite. Because what happened to her wasn't just death, it was a message carved into flesh for an entire kingdom to watch. Picture it, late 613. Cold air. Mud underfoot. A Frankish army packed so tight you can't see the end of it. And in front of them stands an old woman in royal clothing, almost 80, surrounded by men who used to fear her name. Now they're smiling. Here's the part most videos skip. Brunhilda didn't lose in battle. She lost because the people closest to her decided she was no longer worth protecting. And once that decision was made, her fate wasn't trial and punishment. It was humiliation first, pain second, and history rewritten last. Because Chlothar II didn't just want her gone. He wanted every noble, every soldier, every future queen regent to remember what happens when a woman holds power too long, and holds it too hard. And it starts with one death that should have ended everything. Theoderic II, her grandson, dead at 27. In the chaos, Brunhilda does something that sounds small, but detonates the kingdom. She places an 11-year-old on the throne. And that single move makes the room go quiet. Because suddenly, everyone realizes, Brunhilda isn't stepping aside. She's doubling down. An 11-year-old king is easy to crown, and even easier to control. That's what the nobles told themselves. But what they remembered, what kept them awake, was that Brunhilda had been controlling kingdoms for nearly 50 years. Not with charm. Not with compromise. With decisions that left bodies behind. Dukes who resisted her? Removed. Bishops who defied her? Pressured, punished, sometimes worse. And in a Frankish world where men killed men for power every season, there was one unforgivable twist. She was doing it as a woman, and winning. So when Theoderic dies of dysentery, the court doesn't see a grieving grandmother. They see the last chance to finally cut her out. Names start moving in the shadows. Wanachar. Rodo. Quiet men with loud ambitions. The kind who smile in daylight and sign betrayals at night. And then the worst part, it works. Alliances flip. Oaths rot. Messages ride out in secret to Chlothar II of Neustria, her oldest enemy, and the son of the woman Brunhilda blamed for destroying her family decades earlier. This isn't a war starting. This is a trap closing. Because Brunhilda marches out expecting an army behind her. And she's about to discover she's been marching with ghosts. Brunhilda reaches the battlefield expecting steel, banners, loyalty. What she finds is something colder than any enemy blade. Silence. Across the river, Chlothar's forces are real, organized, waiting, confident. Behind Brunhilda, her own camp shifts in a way that feels wrong. Too quiet. Too loose. And then, one by one, the pillars of her power simply step away. The patrician Alphas. Duke Rocco. Duke Sigvald. Men whose titles exist because her government allowed them to exist. Men who once bowed in her halls. They desert before the battle even begins. No clash. No heroic last stand. Just the sick realization that her army has already decided the outcome. And here's the detail that makes it sting. The soldiers don't even mutiny dramatically. They just refuse to fight. As if her life is no longer worth the effort of lifting a sword. Brunhilda looks at the boy king beside her. Sigebert II, 11 years old, wearing a crown that suddenly feels like a target. She understands the truth in a single breath. This isn't about who deserves the throne. It's about who the nobles can live with. So she does the only move left. She runs. Not for herself, for the children. Toward Switzerland. Toward the Germanic tribes. Toward any border that might still mean safety. But Chlothar's riders are already moving. And the chase doesn't end on a battlefield. It ends at a lake, with mud exhaustion, and hands grabbing for royal blood. They're caught near Lake Neuchâtel, not far from safety, close enough to taste it. And that's what makes it cruel. Sigebert II is ripped from her protection first. No negotiation. No mercy. No, he's just a child. In Merovingian politics, a boy with a claim isn't a boy. He's a future war. So the order is simple: eliminate the claim. The young kings are executed almost immediately. Brunhilda doesn't just lose her side. She loses the reason she was running. One infant is spared, just one, kept alive like a political spare key, something to be used later if needed. But the message is clear: Brunhilda's line is being snapped branch by branch. Now comes the part that should have been the end. They bring her, elderly and bound, to the place where Chlothar's army is gathered, Renève. And in any normal story, this is where the defeated royal is locked away quietly. Maybe exiled. maybe killed discreetly. But Chlothar doesn't want discreet. He wants a stage. Because to truly win, he needs the army to see Brunhilda not as a queen, but as a monster. And monsters, in their world, deserve spectacle. So before she's even sentenced, the crowd is assembled. Not a court. Not a council. An army, thousands of armed men, ready to be told what to feel. And when Brunhilda is dragged forward in her royal robes, the jeering starts fast. Like they've been practicing. Then Chlothar steps in, and he doesn't announce a verdict. He announces a story. A story where every dead king is her fault. And the list he's about to read will make the soldiers roar. Even though parts of it are impossible. Chlothar's accusation isn't a charge. It's a weapon. He looks at the army and gives them a single satisfying villain to blame for 50 years of blood. 10 kings, he says, 10. As if Brunhilda personally held the knife every time. He names her husband, Sigebert I, assassinated decades earlier. And the lie is so bold it almost works on sheer confidence. Because that murder had shattered her life. It was the reason she hardened. The reason she hunted revenge. He points to his own father, Chilperic, dead by a mysterious stabbing. He piles on grandsons, rivals, convenient deaths from wars and sickness, as if fate itself took orders from her. One charge has teeth, the killing of Bishop Desiderius. That one is real enough to make the crowd hiss. But Chlothar doesn't stop there, because truth isn't the goal. The goal is this. Turn Brunhilda into a symbol of chaos, so destroying her feels like restoring order. And the army buys it. Not because they're all stupid, because they're tired. Tired of civil war. Tired of shifting loyalties. Tired of fearing what tomorrow's ruler will demand. So when Chlothar says, "This is justice," it lands like relief. Brunhilda stands there, nearly 80, hearing her entire life reduced to a list of murders. And whatever she says, if she says anything, doesn't survive in the record. Because history in that moment isn't being written by witnesses. It's being written by victors. Then the sentence drops. And it's not death. Not yet. First, 3 days. 3 days where her body is turned into a public lesson. So the kingdom learns to fear the idea of her, even after she's gone. And the first step is designed to do something worse than pain. It's designed to erase her dignity. Day 1 isn't about killing her. It's about keeping her alive long enough to be broken properly. They don't rush. They pace it. Because an execution ends fear. But a slow, public dismantling spreads it. The sources don't give us a neat list of every wound, just the duration, the intent, the certainty that it was torture. And that's almost worse, because it means the details were too normal for their world to even bother recording. Brunhilda is old. Nearly 80. That means every pull of a rope bites deeper. Every strike bruises longer. Every fall risks bones that don't heal. And around her, the army watches like it's entertainment. Men who once followed orders stamped with her authority now feel powerful because she can't punish them anymore. But here's the psychological blade. They're not only hurting her. They're forcing her to be seen like this. A ruler who spent decades commanding rooms now can't command her own posture. Her body becomes public property. And between the tortures, there's waiting, hours where she has to sit in the knowledge that tomorrow is coming, and tomorrow is still not death. Just more of this. Then comes the centerpiece. A decision so specific it feels planned long before she was ever captured. They bring out an animal the Frankish soldiers don't normally see. Something foreign. Unfamiliar. Awkward. A camel. And when they bind her to it, it's not just to move her. It's to turn her into a moving billboard that says, "This is what happens when your name becomes too big." The camel lurches forward, and the whole army gets a front row seat. A camel isn't built for grace. It rocks. It jolts. It pitches like it's trying to throw you off with every step. Now imagine that ride after torture. Imagine it when your wrists are bound, your muscles torn, your joints swollen. And you can't even brace yourself. They parade her through the ranks slowly, deliberately. Not a quick lap. A procession. Soldiers jeer, and it's not random noise, it's coordinated cruelty. A chorus that tells Brunhilda over and over what they want her to feel, small. Some shout accusations. Some laugh like it's a festival. And the laughter is the point. It turns pain into permission. Because the moment an army laughs at a queen, something irreversible happens. It means no one is afraid of her anymore. Chlothar wants that. He needs the men to stop seeing a royal prisoner and start seeing a monster getting what she deserves. So every insult, every spit, every thrown clump of filth becomes part of the official story. And Brunhilda can't fight it. She can't even step down. She's lifted above them, high enough for everyone to see, low enough to be reached by contempt. Then they haul her back into confinement. Cold nights. No comfort. Barely enough water to keep her alive. Not mercy, maintenance. Because tomorrow is day 2. And day 2 doesn't escalate in a dramatic way. It just continues. That's what makes it terrifying, the certainty. The schedule of suffering. And somewhere in that camp, as she listens to soldiers eat, joke, sleep, living normal lives, Brunhilda realizes the truth. Her death isn't the climax. It's the finale. The real show is everything they do before they let her die. Day 2 feels longer than day 1 because hope has died. Not hope of rescue, she's too experienced for that. Hope of speed. Pain becomes routine. That's the trap. Your mind starts counting hours instead of possibilities. They keep her alive on purpose. That's the detail that should chill you. A torturer who wants you dead is sloppy. A torturer who wants you alive is precise. So the damage is measured. Controlled. Enough to weaken. Not enough to end it. And all around, the army is learning the lesson Chlothar is teaching. This is what defiance looks like at the end. This is what power turns into when you lose. Brunhilda spent decades being described as iron. But iron still bends when you put it under the right kind of pressure. The kind designed by people who studied your pride. Then they bring the camel out again. Another parade. Another slow, swaying humiliation through men who now feel entitled to her suffering. And what's sinister is the symbolism. A queen of the Franks made ridiculous on an animal that doesn't even belong to their world. Foreign. Awkward. Laughable. A visual insult. By now, her body is failing in small ways. Trembling, staggering, struggling to hold her head up. And to the crowd, that looks like victory. But Chlothar isn't satisfied with her weakness. He wants her erased. So day 3 is the final shaping. The last molding of the narrative before the execution method is unveiled. Because when people hear executed, they picture a blade. A quick end. Even medieval cruelty had shortcuts. Chlothar chooses the opposite. He chooses a death that turns her body into proof. And he doesn't announce it yet. He lets the camp whisper, speculate, dread. And dread, in a place like this, spreads faster than fire. By day 3, Brunhilda isn't being punished. She's being displayed. Every hour she survives becomes part of the performance. Proof that Chlothar has complete control over life and death. The crowd that jeered on day 1 is bigger now. Because suffering is a magnet. And because people don't want to admit they're horrified, so they pretend they're entertained. They keep her conscious as much as possible. That's what the old sources imply, torment without the mercy of blackout. Because if she faints, she escapes. If she dies early, the message shortens. Then, late in the day, the tone shifts. Not louder. Not more chaotic. Sharper. Organized. The kind of quiet you get before something final. Brunhilda is dragged out again, and you can feel the camp anticipating the ending. But Chlothar doesn't give them a blade. He gives them a method that turns the earth itself into a weapon. They bring out a horse. Not a trained warhorse that understands discipline. Something wilder. Less predictable. Muscle and panic wrapped in one body. And that's when the soldiers begin to understand. This isn't going to be quick. Because you don't need a wild horse for a clean execution. You need a wild horse for a spectacle that can't be controlled once it starts. Brunhilda sees the animal and knows instantly what he's chosen. Not because she's been told. Because she's lived in a world where cruelty is a language. And Chlothar is about to speak it fluently. They start tying her. Not just wrists. Not just ankles. They bind her in a way meant to keep her attached no matter what happens next. So the horse can't lose her too early. And in that moment, the entire army leans forward. Because they realize the real execution hasn't even begun yet. The bindings are the most terrifying part, because they reveal intent. This isn't kill her. This is make sure she suffers the full distance. Accounts describe her being fastened by her hair, one arm, one leg. Different sources vary on the exact configuration, but they agree on the principle. She is attached so her whole body will be dragged, not just pulled. And remember, she's nearly 80. After 3 days of torture, she's already injured, swollen, exhausted, half-starved. So when they position her behind the horse, she isn't bracing for death. She's bracing for impact. Chlothar wants the army to watch their fear die. He wants them to see a queen transformed into something the ground can destroy. They step back. The horse tosses its head, senses the shouting, the movement, the tension. It doesn't understand politics. It understands panic. Then someone strikes it or releases it. And the animal bolts. The first jolt is violent enough to rip a scream out of a strong person. For Brunhilda, it's like being yanked into the world by the bones. Her body slams onto the earth. And instantly, the execution stops being a sentence and becomes physics. Stones, roots, hard ground, speed. The horse runs because it's afraid. And fear makes it faster. Which means the faster it goes, the worse it gets. And the crowd realizes there's no clean moment where this ends. Only a moment where the body finally stops moving. But Chlothar isn't looking away. He's watching like a man watching history become permanent. And the soldiers, some cheering, some stunned, are about to see something they'll never unsee. The horse doesn't run in a straight line like a story. It jerks, swerves, stumbles, surges, because it's not performing, it's panicking. And that makes it worse. Every sudden turn whips Brunhilda's body sideways. Every uneven patch of ground becomes a hammer. Every rock becomes a blade you can't dodge. If the bindings are tight, and they are, there's no rolling with it. Her limbs are pulled at unnatural angles, joints screaming under stress they were never meant to endure. The crowd is still there, but the sound changes. At first it's roaring, because people cheer what they think they're supposed to cheer. Then it becomes a mess of different noises, laughter, shouting, and pockets of silence. Because dragging doesn't look like a clean execution. It looks like destruction. The chroniclers later describe her body as catastrophically damaged. Not wounded. Not simply killed. Ruined. And that's the point. A blade would have left a corpse that still resembled a queen. This method leaves something that can't be honored. The horse tears through the area, covering distance before anyone even tries to control it. Because controlling it would shorten the spectacle. And Chlothar didn't build a stage for a short show. Eventually, the animal slows, either caught, exhausted, or finally corralled by handlers. The dragging stops. There's a moment, brief, awful, where people try to read the body for signs of life. A twitch. A breath. Anything. But the ground has done its work. And just when you think the horror has peaked, Chlothar makes one more decision that tells you this was never just about killing Brunhilda. It was about deleting her. Even after the horse stops, Chlothar isn't finished. Because death isn't enough if memory survives. A grave can become a symbol. A tomb can become a rallying point. A place where enemies gather and whisper, "She wasn't the monster they said." So Chlothar removes the possibility. The sources say her remains are gathered and burned. Not buried with shame. Not thrown in a ditch. Burned, reduced so completely that there's nothing left to visit, nothing left to pray over, nothing left to reclaim. Ash doesn't argue back. Ash doesn't inspire rebellions. And that's when the true scale of this execution becomes clear. It's not just physical brutality. It's political architecture. Brunhilda's body becomes the foundation stone of a new story where Chlothar is the unifier, the healer, the man who ended decades of civil war. And people want to believe that story. They're exhausted. They want peace more than fairness. So they accept the theater. The trial that was really an announcement. The accusations that bent time and logic. The 3 days of torture framed as justice. The execution designed not to kill, but to humiliate. And now that she's ash, the story can harden. But here's the twist, because history is never that obedient. The very cruelty meant to erase her is what keeps her name alive. Because rulers who die quietly are forgotten. Rulers who are destroyed publicly become questions. And one question refuses to go away. Was Brunhilda truly a monster? Or was she simply a ruler who played the same brutal game as men? And was punished for surviving it? To understand why the Franks wanted her gone so badly, you have to rewind past the execution, back to what she represented. Brunhilda wasn't born into the Frankish world. She arrived from the Visigothic court, married into Merovingian power, and learned quickly that queen could mean influence, or it could mean captivity with jewelry. She refused captivity. When her husband Sigebert I was assassinated, her grief didn't turn her quiet. It turned her dangerous. Because she did what many men did after a political murder, she pursued revenge, alliances, and control, relentlessly. That's why her enemies didn't fear her only as a person. They feared her as a precedent. A woman who could outlast kings. A woman who could appoint officials, shape the church, punish nobles, and still return to power after every fall. In Merovingian politics, Longevity is more threatening than cruelty.
Cruelty was common.
But surviving long enough to build networks? That was rare. So by 613, the nobles weren't just tired of Brunhilda's iron rule. They were terrified of what would happen if she kept ruling through another child king. Because an 11-year-old on the throne isn't a ruler.
He's a doorway.
And Brunhilda had proven she knew how to walk through doorways and lock them behind her. That's why the betrayal at the river wasn't spontaneous. It was the end of a long decision. A decision that peace was worth more than loyalty, and that her death would buy it. But peace bought with spectacle leaves a stain. And the stain always spreads. Because once an army learns it can laugh at a queen, it starts wondering who else it can tear down next. Here's the uncomfortable truth: a lot of what Brunhilda was accused of sounded believable. Not because it was all true, but because violence was the currency of Merovingian rule. Kings killed brothers.
Queens plotted.
Nobles switched sides like changing cloaks. So when Chlothar says 10 kings, the number doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to feel plausible to men who've lived in non-stop bloodshed. That's why scapegoats work. They take a complicated mess and give it one face. But look closer and you see the pattern. Brunhilda is condemned not only for what she did, but for how unnatural it was for her to do it. A king orders executions and he's strong. A queen does it and she's evil. Same actions, different story. And Chlothar weaponizes that bias perfectly. He doesn't merely say she committed crimes. He frames her as the source of disorder itself, like the kingdoms can't heal until her body is broken. That's why the punishment is so symbolic. The camel parade turns her into ridicule. The dragging turns her into wreckage. The burning turns her into nothing. Each step strips another layer: dignity, identity, memory. And when the crowd witnesses it, they aren't just watching a death. They're participating in the rewriting of what a powerful woman means. Which leads to a disturbing thought. If Brunhilda had been a man, would the same nobles have called her a monster? Or would they have called her a genius? And if that question makes you uneasy, good. Because the last part of this story isn't in the torture. It's in what Chlothar gains from it strengthens his rule immediately. And what it teaches everyone else to accept. The morning after Brunhilda is gone, nothing looks different at first.
The tents are still there.
The soldiers still eat. Orders still get shouted. Life moves on, because that's what power does. It normalizes horror. But politically, everything changes. With Brunhilda eliminated and the child kings dead, the board is suddenly clean. No rival regent. No competing claim with a living symbol attached. Just Chlothar II, standing over the wreckage, calling it unity. And in a fractured Frankish world, unity is intoxicating. People don't ask what it cost if it finally ends the fighting. So Chlothar becomes, in many tellings, the king who reunited the Frankish realms. The first since 561 to hold them all. And that achievement becomes the headline.
Brunhilda becomes the footnote.
The evil queen who had to be removed so the realm could breathe. That's why the execution needed to be unforgettable.
Not for cruelty's sake. For marketing.
Because if you're going to seize total control, you need the story to be simple.
I ended chaos. I punished the villain. I restored order.
And it works. Nobles who betrayed her are rewarded or absorbed. Men who feared her authority suddenly find themselves aligned with the new center of gravity.
But there's a shadow side.
When a regime is built on a spectacle, it teaches everyone that spectacles are how disputes get settled. And the next time a faction wants power, they won't just want victory. They'll want theater. That's the inheritance Brunhilda's death leaves behind. A precedent that fear is a tool, and humiliation is policy. And if you think that ends the story,
it doesn't.
Because the way she dies becomes bigger than her life. The strangest thing about Brunhilda is that the more they try to erase her, the clearer she becomes. Medieval writers repeat the same images. The old queen, the jeering army, the camel, the horse, the fire. Those details stick because they're designed to stick. They're propaganda that accidentally turned into memory. And over time, the question shifts. Not was she guilty? But why did they need it to look like this? Because if Chlothar's case was so strong, why the theater? Why 3 days of torture? Why parading her like an object? Why a death method meant to mutilate rather than simply end? The answer is control. He wasn't only defeating Brunhilda. He was disciplining the entire political class. He was saying, if you stand in the way of unity, this is the price. If you build power outside my permission, this is the end. And the army learned it. Not through a law or a decree.
Through a body.
That's why the camel matters. It makes her ridiculous.
It invites participation.
It turns soldiers into accomplices, so they're invested in Clothar's version of events. Because once you've laughed at her suffering, it's harder to later admit, that was wrong. It's easier to say, she deserved it. And that's the machine of public violence. It doesn't just kill the victim. It recruits the crowd. So yes, Brunhilda dies in 613. But the real aftermath is the story that survives her. A story that still shapes how people talk about powerful women in history. And in the final pieces, we're going to confront the question her enemies didn't want anyone asking. What if Brunhilda wasn't the villain, but simply the last person standing when the knives came out?